Welcome, everyone. We'll begin in just a few moments.
Hi.
I'm doing it. It's about this famous writer. His book was Democracy in America.
Mm.
He wrote it about 200 years ago.
Oh. Video?
All right, I am here.
Welcome, Giacomo. Welcome back. Folks, I'm glad everyone could be with us again this evening. Hopefully you received both a link to the Zoom, but also the syllabus that's posted on the Bethlehem Public Library website, which did have a link to some of the readings we're going to be discussing tonight. It's 7 o'clock. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Giacomo Calabria. Giacomo, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here. Let me just admit a few people. Looks like some in the waiting room. I do apologize for starting a little bit later than usual, but I received a fascinating email about less than 10 minutes ago that I do want to include in today's discussion. Also, I don't know if it's my cell phone or whatever, but I'm appearing really, really dark in my video. So I apologize for that, anyone. I mean, after all, my face is not the showcase of this, De Tocqueville's faces. So I guess we'll be focusing on him. He's better looking than I am anyway. Okay, so Kristen, thank you so much for the introduction. Is there any housekeeping or any announcements from the library that you would like to open with?
What I'll share is that we do have the video file from last week. We are working on that. We are going to be posting last week's content as soon as possible, but we do have some editing to do to kind of put that together for a file that goes on YouTube. So stay tuned for that. We do hope to have all 4 sessions on our YouTube channel at some point and our website in the near future. And like for example, we've already started recording this and we'll have that as well. So that's the only announcement I have right now.
All right, one last question. During these times, I know that we're approaching winter. This might be the most difficult winter in our lifetime. Do you have any advice on how some of the people on here might be able to help their local library or even their local library?
Unmute your speaker or increase. Yes, it'd be nice if I turned my speaker on.
So I'm sorry, Giacomo, you're saying what was the question for me? How can
I said, well, since this
Thanks
is
for
going
your
to,
help.
is everyone able to hear me okay? Excellent, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I was just saying that since this is going to be a very difficult winter, quite possibly the most difficult winter in our lifetime due to COVID and the effects, I was just curious if there's any final words that you might be able to throw out there on how some of the people on this call might be able to help their local library or even help their local librarian.
Sure. So, well, Bethlehem Public Library, we do have some expanded browsing hours. So we do welcome you to the library. If you feel comfortable, we are open. We do have only a certain number of individuals allowed in the library at one time, but we are open. And if you feel comfortable, we encourage you to come in. If not, keep an eye on our programming, because we're starting to do more programming like this, where people from the comfort of their own home can attend programs just like this. And then they're not at risk of putting themselves or any of their loved ones in danger of contracting COVID. So keep your eye out for more programming like this. I think lastly, what also happens is that every time we use Zoom or Google Meet or any of these types of tools, we just get better at them. So I look forward to doing more programming like this. Thank you for asking, Giacomo.
My pleasure. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for hosting this. And thank you everyone who is joining our discussion. So we really breezed through the first section of Democracy in America, which is worth mentioning is the entire volume as it would have been published. So quick thing I do want to say is I received a very good email from one of our members. I believe it was Andrew. Yes, I see you on here. Andrew, thank you for that email that you sent me. I was able to read it in time for class, and it was so good that I actually wanted to quickly share some of it, because these are the kind of questions that really Humanities New York thrives for. So thank you for submitting this. This is an example of an email that I want to receive. So let's quickly look at this, what we discussed last week. So Andrew wrote that Section 1 passed out. Yeah, it missed on wonderful descriptions of Native Americans and his Tocqueville's wonderfully behavioral spectrum. Enslaved blacks totally subservient, Native Americans completely wildly free, and then this consequence. I have already explained the influence of slavery upon the commercial ability of the Americans in the South, and this same influence equally extends to their manners. The slave is a servant who never remonstrates and who submits to everything without complaint. He may sometimes assassinate his master, but he never withstands him. In the South, there are no families so poor as to not have slaves. The citizen of the Southern states become a sort of domestic dictator from infancy. The first notion he acquires in life is that he is born to command, and with the first habit which he contracts is that of ruling without resistance. Now, as I said before, Tocqueville has, in my opinion, some of, if not the most beautiful writing, at the very least, I've ever come across when it comes to the North American continent, the Mississippi River in particular. Now, it's actually his writings on the Mississippi River in particular, where he writes about how completely different the United States becomes the moment you go further down that river. In fact, there's a passage of that was actually used by Ken Burns in the very first section of Ken Burns' The Civil War with respect to slavery. And his writings on slavery, which he actually goes into detail describing, in his opinion, the status of the three races in America. He describes the three races being the whites, the blacks, and the Native Americans. And basically, essentially, he lays out at the time a very valid claim that the white race is the dictator of this continent, and simply for the very obvious fact that they enjoy rights that the other races do not. So I do want to say that there's so much writing on this that I am sorry for time, we didn't go into it, but I did want to use this time to simply not only show that this is available, but here you have the direct quotes over here. As I mentioned, the entire book, Democracy in America, is online at many universities. So you can just do a simple Google search. You could even plug in this particular quote, and you can see specifically where this came from. There's a few other sections I'm going to quickly go through. So he adds that his education tends then to give him the character of a haughty and hasty man, irritable, violent, ardent in his desires, impatient of obstacles, but easily discouraged if he cannot succeed upon his first attempt. The American of the North sees no slaves around him in his childhood. He is even unattended by free servants, for he is usually obliged to provide for his own wants. As soon as he enters the world, the idea of necessity assails him on every side. He soon learns to know exactly the natural limits of his power. He never expects to subdue by force those who would stand him, and he knows that the surest means of obtaining the support of his fellow creatures is to win their favor. He therefore becomes patient, reflecting, tolerant, slow to act, and persevering in his designs. Now, if you were to read a modern text, which I'd actually recommend, I think I mentioned this last class, but a very good book that I read recently, I reviewed it for Princeton University Press, is called The City-State of Boston. And it's a fantastic history of the history of Boston, essentially treating it as an independent republic, somewhat similar to the republics of Italy, such as Venice or Genoa. In there, they make it very clear that the wealth in Boston, despite being a northern city, was a product of slavery. The author actually goes as far as to say that Boston was basically a slave state. It's just its slaves were not in the port of Boston or in Massachusetts colony. So this idea that he lays out there of the difference between the North and the South, it's somewhat simplified as we give further examination and study, but it's worth mentioning that during Tocqueville's time period, this opinion was shared by not only Tocqueville, but also Northerners and Southerners. There was an expression during the time that they said, if you slap a Southerner, he'll challenge you to a duel. If you slap a Northerner, he'll sue you. And not only that, we have writings from, say, even very just like off the cuff writings and statements from, say, Sam Houston, the governor of Texas. During the Civil War, he made it very clear that even though he supported slavery, he said he did not support secession. And he explained that you're going to start a war and you're going to lose. He said the Northerners are different from us. They come from a colder climate, which we in upstate New York really know about. He says they're more mild than we are. They have more resilience, and they're going to come at us like a hurricane that's going to completely eradicate our way of life. So it is worth mentioning that nice little mention over here from the singing jeweler. Thank you very much. In the chat section, I should say. And anyway, so what I am getting at is, as I said in the very first class, the enormity of the North American continent and of the United States during this time, and keep in mind, just technologically, how different people were when it came to travel, that even though they were more similar in ways that they may not have been aware of when it comes to, say, slavery, that the Northerners and the Southerners really did view themselves as completely different people during this time in American history. So very quickly, just going through here, he has 4 points in total. The previous passages were all the point 1. Last time I suggested liberty was about capital. I was thinking to avoid/free oppression, not morals. But then this pre-World War II, when resistance was futile idea, there is twofold liberty. One, natural liberty, in common with beasts, freedom to do good or evil, and cannot endure the least restraint from the most just authority. 2, civil, only which is good, just, and honest. This liberty, this liberty you are to stand for, with the hazard not only of your goods, but of your lives, if need be. And then he closed the email by saying, in school I was taught that the Union was tied together with a rope of sand. I love that. I'm going to ask right now, can you unmute yourself? Let me see. Yeah, Andrew, can you unmute yourself? Are you quoting someone? Where did that come from? The Union tied together with a rope of sand. I love that. Where did you get that? Perhaps he's being shy because it's such beautiful writing. Maybe he created it. If you did, as a published author, I'm deeply flattered. This is a wonderful description. I've never come across this before. And if you are the author of it, bravo. This is great stuff. But here maybe is why the Union is desired, but only as a shadow. Again, this is go on. Please continue. You have the floor. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll unmute him. Let me do that. Can you join us now? Yes, you should be able to talk now. Andrew? Yes, Andrew, I think we can hear you. Could you expand upon this?
I'm wondering, Giacomo, if we're having technical difficulties. I'm not sure if Andrew's trying to mute or unmute, but it's still fantastic writing. So
Yes.
just
Well,
chime in. We'll have him comment, but I'm not sure.
yeah, if you couldn't, yeah, thank you for, yes, I'm sorry to hear that. Please know that we are enjoying your writing very much. If you want, you are welcomed to expand upon that in the chat. I know some of the, plenty of the people here will be able to see that little bit of like a living footnote. And everyone, please feel free to have your own discussions in the chat. You're welcome to. And the last note that he has in here is that I was astonished that Alexis de Tocqueville was already onto how the bail system, English law, favored the rich. Yes, indeed. Keep in mind that the reason why Tocqueville was traveling in the United States is because he was supposed to be researching the prison system. So again, this is great writing. This was all one email I got 10 minutes before class. So please, I encourage you, please write me. This is very good stuff. All that I ask is that if you do want whatever you share to be discussed, as we're doing right here, just send a little bit more notice. Otherwise, I may not be able to receive it in time to put it in here. But this was beautiful. I really wanted it. Andrew, thank you so much for contributing this. This was very welcome and very graciously received. So as I mentioned, we discussed part one, volume one, I should say, of Democracy in America in its entirety. And that was last week's class. And for the remaining 3 weeks of this, we're going to be going through civil society, essentially piecemeal. So this is going to be broken up. We're going to be spending a little bit more time with the text this time. And as I've said, this is, as requested by Humanities New York, a reading and discussion series. I can lecture if you want me to, but from Humanities New York point of view, first and foremost, we want to facilitate a discussion. It's what we want. We have the means to do it. We're able to. So if any of you are interested in offering a point, be it written or simply being spoken, feel free to unmute yourself, interrupt me while I'm talking. I won't be offended. You can raise your hand if you prefer, or you can drop a message in chat. And Kristen, at any time, if there's anything happening in chat, just let me know. This is all for you to really enjoy as an open forum at any time. And so when it comes to volume one, it's broken into several sections. And oh wait, well, the first thing I should mention is I do have a recommended version of Democracy in America that is in the syllabus. I suggest the Harvey C. Mansfield translation. I'm a big fan of his translation and his commentaries on Machiavelli's The Prince. And while his personal politics might disagree with some people, specifically his thoughts on foreign policy, because of his writings on Machiavelli and Tocqueville, I find him particularly desirable because you can compare his opinions so across numerous philosophers. So this is from his introduction for Democracy in America. He said, de Tocqueville went to America, he said, to see what a great republic was like. And what struck him most was its equality of conditions, its democracy. If you remember, that was the opening line of Democracy in America, Volume 1. He sets forth the point of departure in Puritan America and the origin of self-government in the towns of New England. He analyzes the federal constitution that was meant to facilitate democratic self-government and keep it moderate. He shows that the people are sovereign, whether through the constitution or despite it, and he warns of the tyranny of the majority. In the very long last chapter of the first volume, he examines aspects of American democracy peculiar to America, especially the juxtaposition of the three races there, and he speculates about what these portend for America's future. Now, it's actually in there where he has what could be considered some of the most up-to-date information on democracy in America. He mentions Andrew Jackson, he mentions the expulsion of the Native Americans, and it's actually going to be that conclusion, basically the situation between the three races, as he describes it, that is going to be what brings essentially democracy in America to its breaking point, which is going to be the secession of the Southern states and the Civil War over slavery. For any of you who might have been taught that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, that's lost cause propaganda. We have the primary documents. They who seceded make it very clear in their declarations of independence that they were seceding because they wanted to preserve slavery. So just touching upon what he was expanding upon in Volume 1 of Democracy in America, I do have over here, this passage is actually Tocqueville quoting possibly verbatim from the Federalist Papers. It says here, "Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit." That's Federalist number 51, what is considered one of the most important of all the Federalist Papers, and one of the most widely cited, both in the Supreme Court and in academia. So let's think about that. Now, when it comes to justice, and Tocqueville would have known this, the classical idea of justice, as Tocqueville would have been schooled in during this time, is that justice is one of the four virtues, itself a modification of the virtues laid out by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. He said that the four virtues were essentially wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and that itself was modified in medieval times to encompass faith, hope, love, and justice. The idea was that justice was the most powerful of the virtues because it was the only one that could exist as a product of the other three. So basically, justice is only possible in a world or a country where you have faith and hope and love in a position where the conditions are basically felicitous for there to be justice there. So I am curious about this. When it comes to the end of government, in your opinion, is that really the ultimate purpose of government? Is it simply justice? Or do you feel that, say, the United States during this time was created to deliberately be unjust? Sounds like someone is sharpening a knife. I'm afraid I'm not about to get in trouble. I thought the conversation was going pretty good. So I throw it out to you, my merciful audience. What are your thoughts? Is justice the ultimate goal of government? Or in your opinion, are some governments deliberately injustice? Any volunteers? Kristen, are we allowed to pick on people at random?
Well, so the teacher in me just gives a little bit more wait time. I mean, I don't think kids like it when they get called on to answer. So I wouldn't do that, but I think it's okay to give more wait time. And actually I'll put it in the chat now. Again, the question is justice the ultimate goal of government? Let's
see over here. All right, I will trust your instincts. We'll wait all night if we need to. Will anyone volunteer an opinion on this? A simple yes or no if need be. From Phil. Yes, what do we have over here? Phil writes, one would hope it's one of them, but certainly not the only one. Andrew, too simplistic. Oh, all right, too simplistic. It is one of many aims. The goal is to perform functions in the large. Eagle Eye writes, not quite sure what is meant by justice. All right, that's a very fair point. It is worth mentioning that when he's talking about justice, he's talking about justice as he knows it. He's not referring to equality for women, let's say. He might be referring to, say, equality among races. But when it comes to the sexes, the genders, identifications, what have you, he's specifically talking about a government made by white men for white men. So that is a very fair point. And it's also worth mentioning that this country that he's describing and protecting and praising is also the same constitution which has during this time the 3/5 clause when it comes to representation in the House of Representatives. Gerrymandering itself existed during Tocqueville's time. He likely would have learned about that as well. And even when it comes to, say, the presidency of Andrew Jackson, this is during a time where many people were basically coming to terms, at least political opponents were coming to terms that Andrew Jackson was a political force that, if he wanted to, could have been president indefinitely. And there would have been no force that could stop him. So something else that I have over here to expand upon Tocqueville's view. He adds, and again, this is volume 1 for anyone following us. If ever the free institutions of America are destroyed, that event may be attributed to the unlimited authority of the majority, which may at some future time urge the minorities to desperation and oblige them to have recourse to physical force. Anarchy will then be the result, but it will have been brought upon by despotism. Any thoughts on that? Wow. All right, getting straight to the point. Douglas, thank you for offering that. The postal system defunded. You're welcome to expand upon that if you even think it's necessary. All right, well, I am going to pick on someone this time, someone who I know has to speak because he's dead and he's already offered his opinion, Abraham Lincoln. Before we go into this quote, I am getting some replies over here. Let me just see. What do we have over here? Bill, I don't agree the majority has unlimited authority. A lot, but not unlimited. Very fair point. There's a difference between a razor-thin majority and a supermajority. Furthermore, one can even have an incredible majority, but say, lack the will to use it. In many cases, when it comes to, say the power of the legislative branch, which lately has become much more powerful than it might have been in previous administrations. We've seen that in some cases, it could almost be advantageous to be in the minority when it comes to exercising the filibuster. Just one example. Teresa writes, I think many fear we are headed that way, but for different reasons. Without a doubt, it's been made very clear on social media, writings that both sides, both liberal, conservative, left or right, have very different reasons for feeling what could ultimately be the same conclusion. And Andrew writes that functions in the large, tasks that can't be accomplished by one person or in one lifetime. That is very interesting when it comes to one lifetime, because when it comes to, say, some great projects in American history, say, like both successful and unsuccessful, say World War II, or the New Deal or the Great Depression, or even things such as the war on drugs. In many cases, these were things that were meant to be, if unsuccessful in one term or two terms, something that would be continued indefinitely by future administrations, be it popular or unpopular. One example for that could be, say, the War on Terror, which ultimately, I think we could say that during the end of George W. Bush's administration, there were more vocal questions over what exactly was the end result of that. So and now one thing that I do have over here that I want us to discuss is this is from Abraham Lincoln's Young Men's Lyceum address. This is most likely the first famous speech that Abraham Lincoln gave. He was a young man when he did this, only 29 years old. Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio, or make a track on the Blue Ridge, in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, We must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Abraham Lincoln, addressed to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield. He is talking about the subject of the discussion during this Lyceum, a young Lyceum being sort of a place where one could go to hear topics on a certain conversation. Think of it as a YouTube channel before YouTube existed. And one thing that they were discussing today, during this day, was specifically the perpetuation of the Union. How will the Union continue for future generations? And here Abraham Lincoln is speculating, how will the Union end? What could be the very end of the United States, not only in his lifetime, but possibly in our lifetime? He says it's something that will come from home, domestic. In your opinion, do you agree with this? Are we in greater danger from ourselves than any other foreign power? Douglas says yes. Andrew references the Civil War. Teresa, I would say yes right now. But Poppin, I think we are. Eagle Eyes seems so. I do want to mention that when it comes to some of the challenges that we are facing right now, some of the things that we might be even seeing right now, Phil mentions now for the foreseeable future. As I have documented over here, this is Abraham Lincoln really in his late 20s offering this to a crowd that would have warmly received, or at the very least agreed with what he was offering. And when viewed alongside with Tocqueville shared as well, it seems that we're not the first generation to think that America could end in our lifetime. Our previous generations were able to handle these challenges. See over here, it's dated. What about the START Treaty negotiations? Of course, make it very, very clear. This was at a time before anything like the atomic bomb entered the imagination, hydrogen bomb, MAD, any of that kind of stuff. We do have weapons now that can not only destroy the United States, but possibly make the entire continental United States uninhabitable for future generations. So that is a fair point to keep in mind when it does come to the legality of, say, nuclear weapons or the constitutionality of them. But I am sharing this simply to say that when it comes to these discussions on the endurance or even the end of democracy in America and of the United States government in general, that it wasn't simply the Civil War generation, it wasn't simply the greatest generation. It seems that quite a few generations might have found ourselves in similar situations to what we have right now. And the case could be made that, actually, let's think right now. Are we facing a greater challenge than previous generations? Abraham Lincoln here was specifically referring to the beginnings of what became the American Civil War, what Tocqueville described as the disharmony among the three races. In your opinion, what we're facing right now with COVID, with political radicalization, when it comes to domestic terrorism threats, in your opinion, do you feel that the challenges we're facing right now are greater than previous generations? Or do you think that we could actually learn from previous generations who faced greater challenges? Teresa writes, like every generation says, kids these days. Douglas says no. It is fair to say that, make no mistake, there have been casualties when it comes to political division in this country. Gabrielle Giffords has survived an assassination attempt against her by a radical. And Andrew says, I'm not worried until the Senate comes to fisticuffs. That has happened quite a few times. I can't remember the last time there's been a physical altercation on the floor of the Senate, but naturally when, I'm assuming you're referring to the caning of Charles Sumner, that was something that the entire nation learned about. We have yet to see any kind of that kind of physical violence on the floor of the Senate. Phil writes, there's an ebb and flow. There are some generations that had lesser, some greater, and yes, we can absolutely learn from previous generations. But Poppin, I think technology makes the threat to democracy more easily communicated and marshaled. Yes, very excellent point over there. When it comes to, say, misinformation, one person at their laptop is able to create something in an afternoon that can be disseminated to every single corner of this country, whether they're even in this country at the time, whether it be true or not. So there's no doubt that things like that have changed the battlefield. NK writes, I don't think so, but the problems are huge, but we can and should learn from the past. So with that said, let's see what we can learn from de Tocqueville in volume 2 of Democracy in America. So it's divided into several parts, as I mentioned before. When it comes to part 1, we're going to be discussing the influence of democracy on intellectual movements in the United States. And oh boy, does Tocqueville have some harsh criticisms. Keep in mind, this is before Mark Twain. This is before quite a few wonderful philosophers and writers, political thinkers in our lifetime. So he's working with what he has. Chapter 1, Philosophical Method Among Americans. I think that in no country in the civilized world is less attention paid to philosophy than in the United States. Ouch. What are your thoughts on this? Are we oblivious, or I don't know, are we apathetic to philosophy in your opinion? Or is this out of date information? Have there been enough Mae Wests and George Carlins and W.C. Fields to disprove this? So Phil writes, maybe that's because we're such a young country relative to Europe. Excellent observation. Keep in mind, when it comes to, say, the French alone, Tocqueville is working with almost 1,000 years of not only an established government or monarchy, but also philosophers. Of course, they have the Romans that they can turn to, the Greeks. And what do we have over here from Teresa? Many Americans at that time were still pretty low on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All right, very excellent observation as well. It is worth, oh yes, Andrew writes, they were busy growing crops and clearing Indians. I think we can say safely that for Tocqueville as a Frenchman to be visiting the United States, and someone who from his class is coming from a much higher class structure over in France, his standards for philosophy are probably pretty high. And when examining the United States, what does Eagle Eye write? Who needs philosophy when we have the Kardashians and cell phones? It sounds like Eagle Eye is agreeing with this in the modern day. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm simply reporting that. There's no doubt that we're easily distracted, although I will say one thing. We have a wonderful history in the United States of generations complaining about this form of communication brainwashing a generation. Right now we're saying it's cell phones. Before cell phones, we were saying it's the internet. Before that, we said it was cable TV, MTV. Before that, they said it was newspapers. I kid you not, my wife, she recently showed me a primary document from, I believe it was the early 18th century. I'm sorry, the early 17th century, where they said books are ruining our generation. Don't forget comic books. Thank you so much, Kristen. And yes, like I said, my wife, she was showing me this one primary document where they said books are ruining our generation. Everyone has their nose stuck in a book. All they're doing is reading. They're reading about life rather than learning about life, actually interacting with people out there. So, Kristen, I am sorry, but there was a point where libraries were considered part of the problem. What do we have over here from Phil? Yes, it was books that made Don Quixote crazy. Excellent. I love Don Quixote. Thank you so much for throwing that in there. And so let's see, what else do we have over here? All right, so let's go on. So he continues in here, the Americans have no philosophical school of their own. They care but little for all the schools into which Europe is divided, the very names of which are scarcely known to them. Nevertheless, it is easy to perceive that almost all the inhabitants of the United States conduct their understanding in the same manner, and govern it by the same rules. That is to say, that without ever having taken the trouble to define the rules of a philosophical method, they are in possession of one, common to the whole people. We have one comment over here. Let's see. Kristen throws out, please know that I will read any past. Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Kristen. The cat's out of the bag. I apologize for that. Okay, all right, well, let's look at this. Let's actually challenge this because this I am curious about. When it comes to, all right, let's actually challenge this philosophy in the United States right now. If we say got 10 people from different parts of the United States right now, suppose we got 10 people from 10 different states. We did not we did no discrimination, whatever, when it came to how old they were, what the race was, their education, their financial status. How many of these people do you think might know what Oxford University is? Take a guess. 1 to 10. Douglas says 1. How many of them do you think might know who, say, Carl Jung was? How many of them might know who Sigmund Freud was? How many of them might know who Socrates was? They got to know who Socrates is. Socrates, what is it? He's mentioned in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He's so great. So let's think about it. We are a very large country. We have excellent resources to libraries such as Bethlehem Public Library, which we are very welcome to have you to. We are very welcome to be here because of you. I'll throw it out there. I'll tell you what, Kristen, you're privy to more information than most of us when it comes to books that are checked out. How many people are interested in philosophy in these neck of the woods?
I would not say that that is a reference question that I field very often. You know, I work both the children's desk and the adult desk, and you know, folks are very up on popular reading and biographies and young adult literature. You know, certainly we have folks that are interested in that category. I can tell you from my time in public school, you know, some of that content we don't even get to. Like we don't truly have a very strong classics education.
Mm-hmm. Well, then let me expand that then. When it comes to, say, modern works of philosophy, including self-help, for that example, you know, I'm including The Secret when I say that. Like, what was the last philosophical work that was really in demand in the library?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. Well, I mean, when you say the self-help section, that's a whole other category aside from philosophy. So I would say like our self-help collection, like our current stuff. When you talk about, did you say The Secret? When you talk about
Yeah, I
current
mentioned that as
stuff,
an example.
I would say that's a very strong, you know, we get lots of requests, but nobody's doing like Kierkegaard and Jung and some of the older historical characters. I can't think of one offhand right now.
So basically, none of the new biographies on Rousseau or Descartes or anything like that is really in demand. But
We have them.
Yeah.
They're not bursting out the doors. No.
All right. Well, we'll tell you what. As we're going to go through here, since we have a comment over here, about 40% of our population can't even point to Korea or India on a map. Yep. I'm sure some of you might remember when Jay Leno was on, they would do jaywalking. They would occasionally ask people, what's this on the back of the $5 bill? I heard some people say it was the Coliseum. And yes, when it comes to our own map, I have seen just random tests where people couldn't locate Australia. See, took the library out of Albany Public Library. They didn't want it back. Oh, interesting comment over here from Andrew. So again, I mean, it is worth mentioning that things have changed quite a lot since Tocqueville's time. We have quite a few brilliant philosophers in the United States, both living and deceased, both those from after Tocqueville and those that are, of course, in our own time. I personally am a big fan of George Carlin. I actually feel he was never a stand-up comic. He was always a philosopher. I actually saw one of the last performances he did in his life. It was in Pennsylvania, and he said that he wanted to see a Pennsylvania-sized asteroid crash into Pennsylvania because he considered nature the ultimate underdog. Moving along. So I discovered that in America, of most operations of the mind, Each American appeals to the individual exercise of his own understanding alone. America is therefore one of the countries in the world where philosophy is least studied and where the precepts of Descartes are best applied. Nor is this surprising. The Americans do not read the works of Descartes because their social condition deters them from speculative studies. That goes back to one of our comments, people too busy working in the fields or fighting Native Americans, as mentioned. But they follow his maxims because this very social condition naturally disposes their understanding to adopt them. So this is interesting because even though he's saying that many of these works might be foreign to Americans, they can still be classified as, say, whether knowing it or not, being people who have already been talked about philosophically and who could be classified as, whether knowing students or not, essentially being very similar to Descartes in that regard. So continuing on here, he goes to chapter 2, source of belief. Oh, got one comment I want to quickly read over here. Can quote the maxims. Yeah, it looks like there's a typo in here. Oh, can quote some of Descartes' maxims. I mean, I got one for you right now. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The most famous from Rene Descartes. And I have to admit, that sounds a little American now that I think about it. In America, if you think something, it exists, and you're important because you're thinking that. I guess, yeah, I think Tocqueville's right. There is quite there is quite an individuality when it comes to Rene Descartes. Now that I think about it, cheater. Thank you very much. Yes, I cheated by using the most famous example attributed to him, which I happen to have in my back pocket like an ace up my sleeve. I will say out there, I'm sure there's someone on here that knows Descartes much better than I do. I've never formally studied Descartes. So if anyone could, feel free to throw anything else out there and quote. Do scholars agree that Alexis de Tocqueville was accurate on this point about philosophy? I could find out for you. I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that when it comes to Tocqueville's reputation, he was without a doubt cherished as a visitor, specifically a Frenchman going to the United States. So when it comes to him bringing up Tocqueville, when it comes to Tocqueville bringing up Rene Descartes, that they would understand, well, this is someone who he clearly studied very much or was very familiar with as a fellow French national philosopher. I could go into more detail, see if this has been tested, because I have no doubt that there's been scholarly writings on that. I am friends with one of the philosophy professors at U Albany. I'll ask him specifically about that. So moving to the next chapter, Kristen, would you mind reading this, please?
Sure. In the United States, the majority undertakes to supply a multitude of ready-made opinions for the use of individuals, who are thus relieved from the necessity of forming opinions of their own.
Thank you very much. Let's hear it. Does that sound like America to you? Yes or no? Andrew writes, still going on. Fox News found out how to monetize it. Douglas writes yes. Lisa writes yes with 4 exclamation marks. All right, Kristen, spoon feeding the masses. Yes, yep. It's like I mean this. I've said this before. Tocqueville enjoyed so much popularity throughout so many different generations of Americans for so many different reasons. With my father's generation, he said Tocqueville was so popular because of his this prophetic prediction that the United States and Russia had it within their abilities to be global superpowers if given the opportunity. With our generation, without a doubt, this is Tocqueville in his element. We have one comment over here from Phil. It's not necessarily the majority. It's the ones with power and influence and money. That's a very interesting observation, since when it comes to those with power and influence and money, we're talking about basically the 1% or the 0.1%. We're talking about a super minority of the population that they're able to translate into power that could ultimately make their opinions that of the majority. Yeah, very interesting observation over there. So continuing on, chapter 3. One of the distinguishing characteristics of a democratic period is the taste all men have at such ties for easy success and present enjoyment. This occurs in the pursuit of the intellect as well as in all others. Now, let me just quickly see over here. Yes, very good point over here. Just look at some of these comments. So I'd actually disagree with this. I personally think that people are more suckers when it comes to, say, get rich quick schemes rather than get smart quick schemes. But let's challenge this. Does anybody else feel that this is something that's distinguished, that's specifically distinguished in a democratic population? Or do you think that this is just people in general? Or do you disagree with this comment? What are your thoughts on this passage from Tocqueville? I guess we could start with this first part of this. It's 2 sentences long, specifically that all men have such ties for easy success and present enjoyment. So let's see, it is fair to say, yeah, easy success is perhaps a human desire we have from the Papin. There's no doubt about it. When it comes to, say, easy success, we could view it from a capitalistic point of view in the sense that our time is precious. We are mortal. We have only so many years in this world. So if something great could be achieved in a short amount of time, it is more desirable than something could be achieved in a very long period of time. And also when it comes to the United States, it's everywhere from the honeymooners to scratch off instant lottery tickets. People do like the opportunity to be able to get something very quickly that could, say, change their social mobility. Maybe they could go to a higher class in terms of a social hierarchy. Maybe they could suddenly become that very small part of the population that has more wealth or has more political influence, etc. What do we have over here? We have from Phil. I think opportunities are more available here. If you are in a place where there is no opportunity, you don't harbor the taste. Excellent observation over there. Eagle Eye writes that this sounds like human nature to me. And Papin, folk tales are full of tricksters and those desiring easy success. These tales predate democracy in the modern age. Very, very good. And Andrew writes, pleasure is the objective. Declaration of Independence. All excellent comments over here. I wish we could explore those in a little bit more detail. We do have only 10 minutes left though in this conversation, so I will continue them. But please feel free to not only continue to add to the chat, speak to yourselves among the chat. You're more than welcome to. So religion. The main business of religions is to purify, control, and restrain that excessive and exclusive taste for well-being which men acquire in times of equality. In times of equality, that's sticking out to me the most when I read that. I'm curious about that. Does anyone think that that is the main business of religions when it comes to equality? Or, in your opinion, might an organized religion, at the very least at Tocqueville's time, always be that way? My mistake. We're going to be going a little bit longer than I thought. We're going until 8:30 today. Apologize for that. Well, we have one comment, 2 comments over here. But Papin, this is way too big a topic. Phil writes, I would delete equality from that statement. Now, it is worth mentioning that when it comes to Alexis de Tocqueville, he was a spiritual person. He was a Christian. We know from his writings that his faith did have an important role in his life and in his philosophies. He believed that he believed that morality existed because of religion, and thus it was essential in order for morality to exist. Andrew Riley writes, is he meaning men exclusively? Well, it is worth mentioning that when it comes to the faithful, he's referring to all members of the flock for well-being which men acquire in times of equality. I will say, though, to answer your question, when it comes to the latter part, the latter usage of men in that sentence, I think he is referring to men specifically, specifically white men. So let's see what else he expands upon this. Oh, I'm jumping to a different chapter here. So in chapter 13, literary characteristics. They certainly are not great writers, but they speak their country's language and they make themselves heard. Kristen, quick question over here. Off the top of my head, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the most famous work of American literature around this time period would have been The Last of the Mohicans by Cooper. Do you know of any other major works that would have come out around that time?
Well, no, I don't, and not in the 1830s off the top of my head. If there's anybody else in the group think of anything from the 1830s?
It is worth mentioning that The Last of the Mohicans has quite a lot of critics. I was in Saratoga Springs, and one person described The Last of the Mohicans to me as the greatest, worst book ever written. One person throws out Hawthorne. That's one very good observation. And around this time, I don't think Edgar Allan Poe had Poe been doing some writing around this time period? Should have, I think. At the very least, though, I mean, when it comes to Poe, oh man, you know, he's got to be a tough critic if he doesn't like Edgar Allan Poe. I love Poe, wonderful poet. But yeah,
A lot of Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens, of course, is English during this time period. But I mean, without a doubt, though, when it comes to our first truly great writer, I mean, well, it's very interesting. If we were to look, say, if we were looking at more local history, if we were to look at Herman Melville. Herman Melville, when it comes to, say, Moby Dick, that was dedicated, if I'm not mistaken, to Nathaniel Hawthorne. So, whom he considered to be the greatest American writer. And that's about one generation removed from this. I could be wrong. Anyone correct me if I'm wrong. Now, the big one, Mark Twain. We don't have a Mark Twain yet. We don't have anyone close to a Mark Twain yet. So he might have a different opinion when it comes to the history of American literature. But for the time being, he is in a fair point of criticism. We haven't filled that many libraries yet. I'm sorry. We're just getting started as a country. Although I will say, one generation, that is enough time for us to create one great writer. Although it should be fairly mentioned that we have had quite a few poets during this time period, and both men and women, not many of them, and in many cases, correct me, who was that? Yes, that's what I'm looking for. Gail took the words right out of my mouth. We got Louisa May Alcott. And not only that, we basically have many opportunities for writings that are unfortunately lost simply due to circumstances, not only through, big one in my opinion, is slavery, which is depriving so many opportunities, writing, music, other creative fields, but also we do see America in a position where it seems that the main desire is expansion, or basically expanding upon what they already have locally through building and building and building, like urbanization and everything like that. Yeah, we do have a lot of newspapers, though. This is a very fair point. Andrew, newspapers explode in the United States right after the Revolution. The trajectory for them really doesn't change at all. Shortly after we win our independence, we start seeing so many different types of newspapers being published in the United States during this time. And he does go into detail how it really doesn't matter what part of the country you're into. You'll find many different publications and many different offerings specifically that they're catering to. So when it comes to journalism, there's no shortage. Catherine is raising your hand. Let me see. Catherine, we welcome your opinion. What are your thoughts?
Oh, when it comes to writers, we forgot about Washington Irving, the writer of Rip Van Winkle's Tales. He wrote right around this period, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he wrote Rip Van Winkle, of course, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Also incredibly consequential when it comes to our understanding of Columbus. It was actually, if I'm not mistaken, his biography of Columbus is the one that brought in the idea of Columbus saying that the earth is round like an orange, so many of those elements of Columbus that were completely fanciful, or farcical, I should say. So yeah, Washington Irving, that was a very good one. Very big one. We got Emerson being mentioned over here in the chat. Yep, Washington Irving, Dave, that was just mentioned in there. So, and let me just think. In your opinion, well, then I'll throw it out there. We do know the great writers that this country has produced. We have the advantage of hindsight. We know that Mark Twain is going to be coming. We know that Herman Melville, my personal favorite, he's going to be coming in the middle decades. When it comes to some of the other great writers, we have the entire 20th century, so many different products from there. In your opinion, do you think that this is a fair criticism? Let's look at the grand scheme of things. Do you think that America was not creating very good works of literature during this time period? Or do you think that Tocqueville wasn't being fair to the Americans? Douglas says he was not fair. At the very least, I think we can say that the best is yet to come. Mark Twain is someone who, if Tocqueville had lived long enough to encounter Mark Twain, whether he agreed with him or not, he would have not only had a very popular writer, but also possibly a very popular philosopher, depending on his definition of philosopher. So small literary class, population interested a lot in theology. Yes, that is very true. From Teresa, the French do tend to look down their country's culture, down at other countries' cultures. Yes, you have the floor. Yes?
Catherine? Yeah. Just come here a minute.
Yes, your thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm on the Zoom call, right, with the library. And who am I? I'm
Yes, hello?
Catherine's iPhone.
Okay.
That's how I'm identified.
Okay.
I'm not Joe. I'm Catherine's iPhone.
So you're Kevin's husband, Joe?
I'm sorry.
No problem. Did you have anything you wanted to contribute?
Not on that, but think of writers. I think most of our writers are political. I'm thinking of Madison, and I'm thinking of somebody today like David Brooks. He tries to be a philosopher.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think that's actually a blind spot on Tocqueville's part. We have James Madison, we have John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. I mean, a writer and a publisher. We have had basically modern day Renaissance men during this time period. It seems that Tocqueville is being a little bit choosy when it comes to referring to writers. It seems that he's referring to people who were not involved in political writing. He would probably view them specifically as either office holders or political philosophers. He's not referring to people who have done popular works in the United States, but were not from the United States. Like Thomas Paine, he was mentioned over here. It looks like he's probably either classifying Thomas Paine again with political philosophy, or he's viewing him as not an American. But ultimately, I'm actually starting to agree with quite a few people over here. When it comes to the Founding Fathers, we have a plethora of writing when it comes to that. So it looks like he's discriminating when it comes to works of fiction and works of literature. Who knows? Maybe during this time, he, like quite a few people, read The Last of the Mohicans and didn't like it as well. Douglas writes over here, were the Founding Fathers still alive? During this time period, now it's interesting that you mentioned that. During Abraham Lincoln's Young Men's Lyceum address, some of the founders of the United States, I believe he mentions that they were alive during the compromise with Missouri. Or no, wait, what was that? Yeah, during this time period, there should have been a few Founding Fathers still alive during this time period. Now, let me just quickly do some math. So when it comes to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they both lived pretty long lives. John Adams in particular lived a pretty long life. and they both died 50 years after the signing of the Declaration in 1776. So during this time, yeah, Kristen, thank you very much. George Washington, he died in 1799. Of course, Hamilton, dead in his duel. There should have been some of the founding fathers alive, but at this point, yeah, it should have been akin to almost World War II veterans alive today. There would not have been too many left, and most of them would have most likely been retired to public life. If anyone does know if any of the, say, a signer of the Constitution or a signer of the Declaration of Independence was still alive, feel free to drop that in there. My educated guess is there would have been some of them still alive, but probably none of too much prominence. I'm guessing during this time, James Madison had already died as well.
Giacomo.
Yes.
And also, you know, in last week's session, you spoke a lot about the aristocracy, and I keep going back to Washington and how he was so, they thought he was a country bumpkin. I mean, the Europeans and the British that were here, and of course, this is not in the 1830s, but I think there was a snobbishness, and it's possible, and I don't know, that Alexis de Tocqueville, you know, brought that French aristocracy and is just referring to these American writers as, you know, not hillbillies, but just like not as evolved as possibly they could have been, and not European.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very good observation. Thank you, of course, for that. And we did have one comment over here. Douglas, was Madison one of the youngest? He was one of the younger. In fact, he could probably be counted among the youngest. But there were some that were quite younger, specifically Alexander Hamilton, of course. The one who so many people don't know was incredibly young was the Marquis de Lafayette. I know, of course, he was a Frenchman that was visiting over here, but if I'm not mistaken, I think he was only 17 when he first came over to American shores. It's very interesting. I do know that one friend of mine, no, he was a cousin of mine. He had recently turned, I forget how old, he had either turned 27, I think he had just turned 32. And he was reflecting on his age, and he said, yeah, I'm at the age that in this year, basically, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He said, I haven't done anything that good yet. A little bit of a reminder. For this, in more detail, we have one comment over here. That's why the book was written, Democracy in America. Actually, could be considered, yeah, that's a very fair observation, not only of a work of writing, but also as a work of, in some cases, philosophy. This is without a doubt very central work when it comes to not only American popularity abroad, but as I said before, in Harvey Mansfield's introduction, he does describe this as not only the greatest work on democracy in history, but possibly the greatest work on America in history. For this passage, Kristen, well, actually, hold on. Is there a volunteer willing to read this passage? If there be none, Kristen, would you mind?
Sure. By and large, the literature of a democracy will never exhibit the order, regularity, skill, and art characteristic of aristocratic literature. Formal qualities will be neglected or actually despised. The style will often be strange, incorrect, overburdened, and loose, and almost always strong and bold. Writers will be more anxious to work quickly than to perfect details. Short works will be commoner than long books, wit than erudition, imagination than depth. There will be a rude and untutored vigor of thought with great variety and singular fecundity. Authors will strive to astonish more than to please, and to stir passions rather than to charm taste.
Right now, I'm picturing Steve Martin with his banjo and that arrow through his head going, well, excuse me. So let's think about this. All right, so now we're understanding where he's coming from. We don't have great writing because we don't have an aristocracy. Okay, so now it's starting to make sense. So let's see. Phil says spoken like a confirmed aristocrat. Yes, very well. I agree with you. But Poppin writes, this could be said of Dickens too. Ah, interesting observation. Yeah, if any of you pick up Charles Dickens, it's interesting. I always had a few Charles Dickens books that I've never read on my shelf, and I specifically had them there to motivate me to read more because I could always say, do I want to read this book? I've never read A Tale of Two Cities. Well, I finally came around to reading some of those books. Charles Dickens is great. He's a fantastic page turner. As a published author myself, I could say he would have been very successful today because every chapter is a cliffhanger. In fact, Christopher, if I'm not wrong, I think Dickens is where the term cliffhanger comes from. You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, I actually am not sure if that's true, but I'll fact check that for you next week. It is Dickens, the source of the term cliffhanger. I love it.
I think it's from Great Expectations. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's just I think it is. But moving on in more detail, though. So yeah, he is saying over here. I mean, of course, Dickensian. I mean, is associated with poverty. Being impoverished and the worst work conditions and social conditions, dangerous to children. So yes, could be said over here about Dickens. I agree with that very much. Very fair observations here. But as I said before, there's times where remember how Tocqueville was talking about how there's like a new coat of paint in a democracy, or at least in America, but every now and then the paint chips away and you start seeing its aristocratic lower surfaces. We are learning a little bit of Tocqueville when it comes to this. And this is good because I do want us to keep this in mind. While America has not had its great writers during this time period, while we've not had Mark Twain or Herman Melville yet, nothing changed when it came to aristocracy between the time that this was written and the time that Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn. So maybe we did not, maybe he's wrong when it comes to the aristocrats. We did not need them in order to have them. What did Gail write over here? Many written works were published in magazines to be available in installments to the masses. Again, that's Charles Dickens through and through when it came to his publications. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think Oliver Twist was published in installments of 2 chapters each. And not only that, when it came to the later 19th century, in Europe, as well as in America, you would have some very famous works that would be published as inexpensive magazines that could be picked up and published in serials. So moving on over here, the trade of literature. I just got to say, this is great. I mean, so many people are picking up democracy in America. They're going to think we're going to be talking about, like voting or like, I don't know, gerrymandering or something. He spent a lot of time talking about our literature. It's not always complimentary, but it is a nice little surprise. So let's see what he has over here. Chapter 14, the trade of literature. The genius of democracies is seen not only in the great number of new words introduced, but even more in the new ideas they express. Malarkey. All right, so let's throw that out there. We are a big old country. We got a lot of different slang, a lot of different accents. What are your thoughts on this one? Douglas, LOL. All right, that was one introduction that we gave to the world. If I'm not mistaken, I think LOL is officially in the Merriam-Webster dictionary at this point. It better be. I don't know if it's acceptable in Scrabble yet, though. All right, so let's think about this. Well, I can say that historically, because, oh, LOL for malarkey. Thank you very much. For those who are interested, malarkey, the term popularized by Joe Biden in the recent, and also in the 2012 vice presidential debate. I recently looked up the etymology of malarkey. First of all, I had already known what malarkey was. It was mentioned in a Looney Tunes cartoon when I was growing up. It was with the wolf from Three Little Pigs. And he lost his tail and he was telling the story of the Three Little Pigs and he was all sympathetic. And the kid's like, that's a bunch of malarkey. He's like, does this look like malarkey? And he lost his tail. Anyways, when it comes to the etymology of malarkey, it is somewhat unknown from what I saw. It's popularized by Irish Americans. And malarkey simply is another way of saying nonsensical speak. If any of you are interested, there's an online etymological dictionary. Just do a Google search for etymological dictionary. It is beautiful. Type in any word in there. They'll give you the whole history, going back to previous roots and changes for any words. It's fantastic. I used it when I wrote both my books over here. So highly recommend that. But yeah, when it comes to the introduction of words, one thing very interesting. Usually in the history of the United States, one of the biggest factors that led to the introduction of new slang and new words is actually wars. Because when you have a war, you're going to have so many people from different parts of the country that were never in communication with each other. They're now all of a sudden in the same battle or, spending several months with each other. And sure enough, some of the most creative, be it profanity or be it what have you, is going to float to the surface. Civil War was an excellent example of this. We got so much great slang from the Civil War. We got the word rookie, which was a variation of recruit. We got skedaddle. And when it came to, say, World War I and World War II, we got so much slang, which is still used right now, such as, what is it, snafu? I'm sure we all know that one. And what was the one? What was it, foobar? A lot of that. But for those of you who are interested, but what is interesting is he's talking about democracies in general when he's talking about that. And of course, we have countries that were not democracies that were going through world wars as well, in some cases experiencing something similar. Andrew Riley writes, well, today we need an urban dictionary. No, we are war required. Yes, that is very fair. And also during this time period, he's most likely referring to democracies in general without too much focus on the war. Because when it does come to the American Revolution, well, you would have people from, say, urban and rural areas fighting in the same areas or fighting in the same military units, or you might have, say, a regiment from one state going to another state, like George Washington as he was retreating from the Battle of Long Island. The truth is, the factors that I was discussing that usually leads to major changes in a language would not have necessarily been happening too much during the American Revolution. So in this case, he's probably talking about, say, the Western migration of people, or say, when it comes to new states being added to the Union. But Papin writes, slang is often the second way of saying something more complex. But are these really new ideas? Oh, these aren't new ideas at all. Slang goes through fantastic evolutions. We have joke books from ancient Rome, and in there we have so many different variations of meanings. Of course, the Bard, William Shakespeare, which is basically his plays are an encyclopedia of slang and different uses. And even before him, we have Chaucer, we have Dante Alighieri. None of those figures were writing in what we would call democracies. Andrew Riley writes, real literary democracy had to wait for the invention of Twitter. I will leave that to the public to decide. Anyone feel free to comment on that. You can unmute yourself and offer your opinion on that one. I want to hear your thoughts on that. So basically, in part, very good observation, Douglas. Very clever. Okay, so continuing on over here, we have chapter 21, Parliamentary Eloquence in the United States. Democratic country, oh, let me adjust my glasses. Democratic countries' parties are so impatient of control and are never manageable except in moment of great public danger. Even then, the authority of leaders, which under such circumstances may be able to make men act or speak, hardly ever reaches the extent of making them keep silence. Now, this is interesting. I'm sure many of you have had opinions about this when it comes to, say, the current political climate in the United States. We've lived through several crises, the one that we're going through right now, of course, when it comes to COVID-19, also when it comes to, say, 9/11, the war on terror, and for those of you who were alive during the time of the war in Vietnam and other crises. So Andrew writes, Trump muter required. Fortunately, we do have mute buttons when it comes to this discussion. And Kristen, if I ever get too ahead of myself, you have the power to mute me. I will not protest. But let's actually throw this out there. In your opinion, do you think that this is something specific when it comes to democracies? We have in our own lifetime, including recent history, we have had moments where we've been able to gather together to do something. And there have been times where it would seem like that would not be possible. If basically, I have seen pretty persuasive arguments that if Al Gore had been president during 9/11, there's a chance he may not have enjoyed the same level of popularity that George W. Bush did. for a variety of reasons. So let's actually let's challenge this. In your opinion, do you think that the division that we have in our country is a product of democracy, or is it actually something, in your opinion, is it something different that's causing this logjam in our country? Well, if anyone does have a thought or a comment on this, feel free to drop it in the comment section. Happy to go back in. So continuing on this, and again, you can still reply to the same question because we are in the same chapter here. The general interest of a party frequently demands that members belonging to it should not speak on great questions which they understand imperfectly, that they should speak but little on those minor questions which impede the great ones. Lastly, and for the most part, that they should not speak at all. To keep silence is the most useful service that an indifferent spokesman can render to the Commonwealth. Wow, he's right. Someone replied. So we have one comment over here. Some of the division in our country is a relitigation of the Civil War, which has never really been resolved. Gale writes, the cacophony of ideas and voices is democracy. The vitriol is not. It is to silence opposing truths. Very, very interesting. Any other thoughts on this discussion? I just have to say, Tocqueville was right. I didn't even ask a question over here. I just shut my mouth for about 10 seconds. And this is great feedback we're getting here. Andrew writes, it makes me think of the desire for government to be a shadow except when needed. Division arises from differences of what when needed means. Now that is an interesting point in the sense that, as we remember during 9/11, the country was already quite divided when it came to the results of the 2000 election and, of course, Bush v. Gore. And that's notwithstanding the politics of the 1990s when it came to Bill Clinton and the Lewinsky scandal. So we were already politically divided, became even more so as a result of the election. And then it was the crisis of 9/11 that caused what's psychologically called the rally around the flag effect. The idea is if there's a major crisis that's affecting the national identity or even the national pride of a people, that there will be a temporary, basically there'll be a temporary silence of criticisms in support for national unity. One line that Phil drops over here, I agree that it's the interest of the party, doesn't mean it happens. So ultimately, there are many interesting pieces in here for us to be discussing. For one, I think we could all benefit from a little bit more silence, or at the very least more listening in politics rather than speaking. It seems like from what's being mentioned over here, it seems that Tocqueville is advocating a mute button if need be. But I do have one other comment over here from Andrew. Odd for the 2-volume writer to be advocating silence. Hey, listen, volume 1 was a huge hit. He's just doing the most American thing you can do, which is cashing in. So no complaints over there. This is him being an honorary American. All right, so let's move on over here. He continues. All right, so here he's bringing it back to himself as a Frenchman. The orators of France frequently speak to mankind, even when they are addressing their countrymen only. Well, I mean, can't disagree with that when it comes to, I think, therefore I am. He wasn't speaking just to the French. And he could even be, even Napoleon, he actually made quite a few grand demonstrations when it came to mankind, or universally when it comes to military history. Teresa, a little puffed up again. This is Tocqueville. This is his personality. You're getting what you paid for. As I said, he is absolute. Time for the Steve Martin reference again here. Oh my God, yes. As I said, this is what you get with Tocqueville. Now, it doesn't mean that he's always wrong. It just means that this is going to be the personality that is going to be in some cases prejudicing his opinions of not only democracy in America, but of Americans in general. No matter what, we don't have an aristocracy, which in Tocqueville's opinion is going to be a flaw. He's outright going to go in more detail in volume 2 about how it is a weakness for us, scientifically, intellectually, philosophically, that we do not have an aristocracy. And as a result, the great geniuses that we do have in our government, our intellectual achievements, that is a product despite the advantage that he believes an aristocracy offers. And keep in mind, I mean, when it does come to the offerings of an aristocracy, they were not completely without merit. When it came to, say, during Tocqueville's time period, when it came to, say, ballooning in, some of the very first works that we did when it came to air travel, basically that was a hobby that was encouraged and financed by very wealthy parties. When it comes to, say, Lorenzo de' Medici and the High Renaissance, it was the wealthy, the aristocrats in Italy that were able to finance so many of the intellectuals during the High Renaissance. So it's not that he's completely wrong. It's just history would show that there's going to be more options for intellectual creativity than the ones that had been so standardized during Tocqueville's time and before. So we're nearing the end. We have about 5 minutes for open dialogue. If anyone is interested, I have no problem unmuting everyone if need be. Any final thoughts or subject for discussion during these final minutes? Feel free to raise your hand or drop a comment. I'll read anything, or simply unmute yourselves. Andrew writes, he was here for about a year, much of that spent traveling. Lots of generalizations on seemingly important local topics. How did he have time or insight to draw them on such a small sample size? Too general. Well, it is worth mentioning that when it came to Tocqueville, while he does spend a lot of time traveling, he really does interview anyone who's interested in giving him his opinions. So by the time his travels are over, he does have a pretty good catalog of people that he puts together. And not only that, he also learns quite a lot through observation. There's one part, I don't know if this is in the writings of Tocqueville, or if it's in the letters of Tocqueville, or if it's in the book Tocqueville in America, which again, I highly recommend. Tocqueville in America is the whole history of Tocqueville before he published Democracy in America. There's one anecdote that I remember coming across where he was observing, I believe, a theater, some sort of public presentation, and he was able to observe so much in terms of class based on where people were in the theater with regards to their race and thus their social status, their liberties, etc. Do we know how many people he talked to? It's possible that we could get a finite number of named individuals that he directly spoke to, not simply through correspondence, but in his research, he could say he spoke to this person. We need to assume it's much larger than that, simply because it's simply, in my opinion, it's just smart to assume that there would have been people that he spoke to so briefly that he probably did not get their name or credit them. And keep in mind that this work that he writes, while it does have some notes and citations, it's not a work of modern scholarship. This isn't something where he had to back up every single source with a university press or a footnote saying via letter, via correspondence. But on that subject, we do have lots of letters from Tocqueville. Quite a few of them are online if anyone are interested. He had a plethora of correspondence. So that, in my opinion, shows that he was someone who, at least when it comes to pen and paper, was very conversational with a very large group of people. And I see that there's no reason not to assume he was doing the same with those we met in the United States. Kristen, we are running out of time. I do know that we have a very specific schedule. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
No, I'm looking forward to next week's session. We have 2 final sessions. Again, if you haven't visited the Bethlehem Public Library homepage, we did post the syllabus there. In addition to having it was sent out to all registrants last week. We did have a couple people join us this week, so if you're looking for that, it is on the Bethlehem Public Library homepage. And please stay tuned for these sessions to be posted online. Giacomo, thank you for a wonderful and engaging and thoughtful presentation again, and I enjoy every minute of it.
Happy to be here again. Thank you all. And again, if any of you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is on the syllabus. And like I said, if you want it to be actually shared for discussion, mention it in the email. I'll start next class with them.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. We'll see you next week.
Have a good week.